And the final item for this evening is members' allowances, something that very rarely comes before us for the simple reason that we, some years ago, pegged any increases in members' allowances to whatever increase was paid to salaried staff, and that made it very simple. It meant that we didn't have to have annual debates on members' allowances. But periodically, we do have to bring in the independent panel to have a look at members' allowances, and that has happened again, and therefore we have a report before us today. Councillor Forrest has asked if he can join us for this item, so if you'd like to come forward, Jim. The report, just so it's totally transparent, the report of the independent panel is there at Appendix A, so that is there for members to consider. The executive doesn't make a decision on this any more than the scrutiny board does, but it is a matter for the next council meeting. But the scrutiny board has considered it, and on the sheet of paper which is before members, they've made some comments and suggestions on there as well. So I just ask members to bear those in mind when we come to consider the report. So I'm going to ask Councillor Forrest to address this tonight.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak. In your invitation to do so, you did remind me that this is an issue that will be decided at full council. However, I'm always glad to see the full council recognised as the sovereign authority in council. But in this case, I note that the executive is asked to put forward a recommendation to the council, and I'd like to question one aspect of that. Now, this is not normally an issue that I comment on when it goes up from time to time, because I've always felt that the great merit of having an independent review panel is that it takes the whole issue out of the political arena, out of partisan debate, and also removes any public perception that councillors are voting themselves huge sums of money. However, I think in this particular case, the process has, I think, very much inadvertently taken on what could be seen as a political cast, because the executive leader has put forward a proposal which involves a change in the position of the minority leader, making the special responsibility allowance for that post dependent on the size of the minority group. The executive leader was able to go to the independent review panel and state the case for that. But as far as I understand, the minority leader himself was not asked to give a view. And I think in a borough which prides itself on indulging in consultation wherever possible, this is a process which somehow lost that element of consultation. Now, as someone who has previously held the position of minority group leader, I think I'm in a position to make some comments to executive members. First of all, I think much of the work of the opposition leader is not dependent on the size of the group. However many members there are in that group, there will always be the need to have regular briefings with the Chief Executive Officer. There will be the obligation to scrutinise proposals that come to the executive. There's the obligations for making policy responses to what is proposed. There's a need for a group leader to respond whenever possible to press inquiries. And I think there's also frequently an obligation to attend public functions, so that the multi-party nature of the council is properly represented at them. None of these are any different. Well, there are 3 members in the group, maximum of a minority group would be 15. The responsibilities there are the same. And I think in several ways, the leadership of a small group involves greater pressures than leading a large one, because quite simply there are fewer people to share out the roles and the responsibilities. A group leader in a small group has to be, in effect, his own secretary and organizer to convene the group meetings. He or she has to supply backup from time to time for a small group who are sharing the various spokesmanships around the council. So I hope this executive will consider these as grounds to withdraw the proposal to change the basis of the minority leaders' allowance. Or at the very least, I hope you might consider deferring the item to a future meeting of the independent review panel, which the minority leader would then be invited to attend. I think that would allow examination of the issue in an impartial forum rather than in the partisan atmosphere of a council debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Councillor Forrest. I think the point I made on the opposition leaders' allowance is that there is a scheme which was put into place quite a few years ago, and that scheme did say that there should be an amount paid for, given the size of the opposition group, or the main opposition group. So that was in there, showing that if a group was at a certain small level, there would be a certain allowance payable, and that if the group was larger, then there'd be a larger allowance payable. And then that was effectively negated with a note at the bottom which said, but if there's, it didn't matter, if there's only one group, it gets paid at the full whack anyway. So that was what I raised, was that inconsistency which was within that. And I suppose it's also relevant that at the time this particular members' allowance scheme was originally put into place, then of course we did have a situation where we had, from memory, we had 17 members of the Conservative group and 14 members of the Liberal group. And I don't imagine it was ever anticipated at the time the allowance scheme was put into place that we would ever have such a tiny opposition group on the council, which was down to 4 or 5 members. So that was what triggered it in my mind, that there was a scheme written perhaps for a different day, and it was just because of a note at the bottom that the scheme wasn't being followed. So I asked the independent panel to have a look at that. Also, of course, I don't know how the independent panel ran their scheme, why Councillor Price didn't ask to address the panel. I don't know whether he was made aware that the panel was happening, was invited to address it, or whether the panel should have invited him to address them. So I really don't know on that, and I probably want to find out, because I do agree that it would only be fair that he would have been able to make representations if he'd wished to on that. So perhaps I can, now you've raised it, take that away and have a think about that before the council meeting. So thanks for raising that. As a matter of principle, I think I should say that we have always followed the recommendations of the independent panel when they have met, and so my personal view is that, notwithstanding what Councillor Forrest says, which we can think about between now and the council meeting, that as a principle we should recommend to the council that the panel views are followed, and I think that's how it should be. The only item that I was going to raise, and it came from out of the scrutiny board as well, is the item to do with the council's designated independent persons, they're called, because we did used to have a situation where there were 2 of these designated independent persons, and essentially what they're to look after is members' standards issues, and if there are members are reported for any reason, unfortunately something that seldom happens in this council, but if there is any sort of report, then there can be some quite complex complaints possibly that do need to be looked into about members, and that perhaps it would be reasonable, contrary to what the independent panel says, to actually have a look at that issue. We have one independent person, that's David Basson. He needs to look at things which do come up, so I do wonder, and the scrutiny board did discuss this as well, whether it would be reasonable to make a proposal that that allowance should be paid differently, as is suggested by the scrutiny board. The incremental cost, I'm advised, is £14 annually for the next 4 years, which I think we can probably just about afford. And we're also making a saving because we only have one such person rather than two. So I think I'd like to suggest, especially as he is also the independent person for Southampton City Council as well, and they're reviewing their remuneration to him at this time, then I suggest that it would be the right thing to do in principle to have a look at that, as it will cost very little, and recognise the diligent work that person actually does do. So that's the only recommended change I would make to the report, to the recommendations which are before us. Would anybody else like to comment so we can formulate our recommendation?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think I totally agree with the points you raised already. I think it is important that we take the report of the independent panel. That's what they're there to do. So I think that's fine. I think the point you made on the designated independent person is also correct as well. So yes, happy to support that.
Thank you. Councillor Evans and Councillor Spell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your point in terms of we have an independent panel, and I think we run the risk of going down a very difficult area if we start rejecting bits and accepting other bits. And I note in the recommendations that the reason that the current members' allowance scheme does expire this year, so this hasn't been a casual look by the independent review panel. They have looked at the totality. They made one or two statements, which I guess we could reasonably look at in future, because I think they also recognise that trying to do comparisons between different authorities is notoriously difficult, without knowing how many councils are, what the nature of the responsibilities are. There's a whole range of issues. So at this stage, I would go along with the recommendations of the independent review panel, and maybe we do come back and look at some stage in the future, or ask them to look at whether they can do any meaningful comparisons with other authorities. But I recognise the difficulty in that area.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think it's important that if we have an independent review panel, that we should take their recommendations forward and not start to politicalise the recommendations. We're trying not to do that. But I do take on board Councillor Forrest's comments about input from the leader of the opposition, and I would like that just to be clarified and looked at to make sure that it's transparent and open with regard to members' pay. Members' pay is always a hot topic, and I think we have to make sure that we're completely transparent about it all the way through. I also take on board your recommendation about the independent person, and I would be happy to support that. We only have one, and I would be happy to support that.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments members would wish to make? Okay, well, taking on Councillor Evans' point, I think it is an important issue to look at. It is very difficult to compare, of course, between authorities. There are many hundreds of councils around the country, and they all have schemes for members' allowances which differ in some way. We have subsistence allowances, which is recommended. They reduce quite significantly. They are seldom claimed as well. A lot of people do a lot of things which they don't then put in some sort of claim for. Some people claim mileage allowances, some don't. Some councils pay IT allowances to councillors, some pay for their internet usage, we don't. So there are differences between them. And I did an exercise just looking at all the councils that have a similar members' allowances budget to us. And again, there are many of those as well. And I think one thing worth bearing in mind, which harks back to the past a bit, of course in 2002 we took a decision as a council to, when we had a reorganisation of the ward boundaries, to very significantly reduce the numbers of councillors. And we reduced the number from 42 down to 31. Now, of course, doing that, the work didn't go away. So we have 31 councillors who are arguably, but I'm sure in most cases are, working much harder than the 42 councillors that preceded them. So there's more to be done because the job is still there to do. So, you know, it's perhaps not the most helpful thing to compare what it is per councillor with other authorities, but maybe just to look at the total members' allowances budget and say, does that seem a reasonable amount to actually be doing to try and head off, you know, to try and get people to be councillors, which isn't the easiest thing, because councillors don't receive salaries, so they don't have contracts of employment, they don't have, there's no state-funded pensions for councillors, and when you lose your seat, as we do, and it does happen, you don't get a payoff or anything like that. So, you know, it's a different sort of situation, a very significant voluntary role within it, and clearly a very significant financial loss for people that put their time into councillor duties rather than perhaps pursuing careers where they would probably be very highly remunerated. So I think it's a number of things need to be taken in the balance. That's what the independent panels think. So the recommendation I'd like to make to council is that we do support the independent panel's recommendation with the but with that change to the designated independent person, and I'll have a recommendation, I'm sure, on that for the council meeting, and that we also look into the issue that Councillor Forrest raised and just look at sort of what happened, how it happened, and if anything needs to be done to allow an input to happen there. So is that agreed? Agreed. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of the meeting. Thank you very much.